This is TLV1.
Hi, this is Gilad.
And Dahlia.
Before we start the show, we want to let you know about a very special event that will be taking place in London. That's for all of our UK listeners, and we know who you are. On the 6th of December, we'll be holding a live event where we'll be interviewing the acclaimed journalist Ian Black, the former Middle East editor for The Guardian. We'll be speaking about his new book entitled Enemies and Neighbours, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel, 1917 to 2017.
The event will take place at City University at 6 p.m. It's a free event. Please join us. Check out our Facebook page for updates. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel. We look forward to seeing you.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I am Gilad Harpen. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Nicholas John. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Communication at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. As well as his work on sharing in the digital age, he is interested in disconnectivity and unfriending. Today we will be discussing his book, The Age of Sharing, that was recently published in English by Polity Press. Dr. Nicholas John, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Your book focuses on different aspects, practical as well as conceptual, of sharing. On the one hand, it's a pretty straightforward term suggesting distribution or dissemination. But on the other hand, you refer to it throughout the book on several occasions as a metaphor. What kind of metaphor?
I think it's a pretty central metaphor for digital culture today. When I say it's a metaphor, what I mean is that it's a word that takes meanings from different social spheres and shunts them around from one to the other. So I think about sharing as the key word for the digital age. It's what we do online. But we can also think that sharing is the name for a type of communication. So we share our feelings with significant people in our lives. Now, by saying that sharing is a metaphor, we can see that in the way, for instance, that social network sites, for instance, Facebook, tell us to share on Facebook and give that very often an emotional valence. So they're taking a meaning from one social sphere, that of communicating our emotions, and they're bringing that into the sphere of social network sites, and they're trying to infuse those acts of updates and telling people what's going on with our lives with this same kind of associations that we have with sharing feelings and sharing emotions.
I think you make a very good distinction here, sort of guides the book between two types of sharing in particular. You talk about the therapeutic culture and the sharing as selling, which are two different things, and I really want us to talk about both of them. But let's start with the therapeutic one. I mean, you tie this back to, Alcoholics Anonymous and the growth of sort of the group therapy language, which certainly predates the internet and even has religious roots in the Oxford group that you analyze quite in depth, and confessional concepts. What is the line between those earlier iterations of group sharing from, let's say, the early 20th century and then through the 1970s to the current online therapeutic sharing culture?
Okay, well, let's go back maybe even before the early 20th century, when sharing used to mean a kind of division and a kind of allocation. So you can think of having a fair share of a cake or something. I don't know. You could share out your candies. This is the kind of original sense of sharing, of dividing up and distributing. It was in the early 20th century that the word started to mean talking. The idea of sharing your troubles was already familiar by the early 20th century, but there the metaphor was actually still one of division. You would take your troubles, divide them, give half of your troubles, metaphorically speaking, to your colloquitor, and your troubles would thereby be lighter. So this is the sense in which sharing as talking was still very closely tied to its meaning of division. With the early 20th century, people started to use sharing to refer to the talk itself. And you mentioned the Oxford Group, which certainly hasn't been tied to the history of digital culture or therapeutic culture. I think it should be. The Oxford Group was an evangelical group of Christians that was operating in the 1920s and 1930s in the United States. And what they would do is they would sit together in someone's parlor, a group of people, and they would openly confess their sins to one another. Rather than going to the confessional, to the priest, they would tell one another, and they would listen to one another, and they would find some kind of redemption in this act that they called sharing. Now, two alcoholic members of the Oxford Group split off from that, or rather formed a separate group that was aimed at a place where they could talk about their alcoholism. They continued to call this type of talk sharing, and there it was really institutionalized and spread throughout Western culture, where we know that in Alcoholics Anonymous, after you have told your story of your struggles with the bottle over the last week, the other people in the group thank you for sharing. This is a very familiar trope nowadays. And from there, that idea has spread throughout therapeutic culture, or our culture whereby we talk about our feelings in order to cure ourselves of emotional suffering, in order to expose ourselves to other people, to gain intimacy.
And do you think that this sense of sharing was imposed by the culture of the internet on a global level, or is it just, a byproduct of the actual, the fact that they were using that word? Do you think that it was masterminded in any way, or was it just, the way it turned out?
No, it wasn't masterminded, but sharing became, if we now jump ahead to the beginning of this century, sharing became a resource, a cultural resource that was available to the people who were setting up social network sites. If sharing is today what I call the constitutive activity of social media, there's a number of pathways to that point. One of them is through this therapeutic sense of sharing, which is picked up by social network site people, marketing people. Another pathway is through computing, where the concept of sharing has been visible in that scene ever since the beginnings of the large computers, and which were time shared. There, the sense of sharing had no particular normative valence. It was the computer's time was being shared between users. It was being cut up into chunks and distributed among users. So that sense of sharing also comes through in social network sites and social media. I don't see some kind of conspiracy of nefarious men with mustaches and cigars. However, there are moments that we can see this idea of sharing really taking off. I think that for many people, and this has been expressed in various different ways in various different texts, for many people, the internet has always been about sharing. However, you can look back at texts about the internet at different stages of the internet's development, and people at the time, say the mid-1990s, the early 2000s, actually aren't talking about the internet in terms of sharing, which is to say that concept hadn't yet quite become...
So what was it then? What did it talk about?
It was gifting, I think, was the main metaphor that was used for the internet. That people were talking about Napster, for instance, in terms of a gift economy, that people were gifting other people their music files.
But it's very interesting. What I'm noticing is that you do have this categorization of the therapeutic culture and the sharing as selling. But what you're actually saying now is that the people who kind of turned the internet into sharing a little more consciously were commodifying the sharing itself. In other words, it's the sharing that was sold.
For the last 100 years or so, I think the idea of sharing has had a complex relationship with consumer culture, with commodification. Even the Oxford Group was a group of people who were exploring their identity at a time of destabilization of identities and grand narratives, where people were moving to cities and they were living anonymously, where the church was in decline. So even there, after the event analysis of groups like the Oxford Group says that these were people who were searching for identity in an unstable time, and it was unstable precisely because of the rise of consumer capitalism, advertising, the idea of surface as opposed to depth, and destabilizing serious anchors of our identity. And one way in which people tried to restabilize themselves was to talk their self into some kind of being.
I mean, I see a lot of continuity here. You talk about Robert Putnam and his thesis about people, America being increasingly alone, right? The traditional community structures that broke down over the course of the 20th century and people seeking to reconstitute communities in new and different ways. So is the internet really such a big change, or is it just a new technological platform for a century-long, deep search for community among lonely Americans? And obviously not just Americans.
When we think about the role of the term sharing in this, it is often used to hark back to an era of community. It may be that this era is imagined, that this is some kind of idyllic past where people lived in villages and everybody knew everybody. And I think that sharing does serve for some people to bring us closer to that imagined past of community. There are a number of ways in which it does that. One is through the association of sharing with childhood. It refers back to a natural or maybe pre-socialized state of being before we're corrupted by society.
Would that relate to the Facebook, what was really Facebook's biggest kind of wave in the beginning of people finding their childhood friends and kind of reliving their childhood experiences through photos that they would suddenly post? Does that relate to what you're talking about?
I'm not sure. I think Facebook was enabling us to reconnect with people we already know. I think that's much of what we do on social media is communicate with people who we've met outside of those media. Not all of it, clearly.
I'm thinking particularly about the nostalgia factor. Facebook loves to sell nostalgia.
Right. Facebook is pretty strong on schmaltz around Valentine's Day, for instance, around their own Friends Day. They invented a day.
Okay, which brings me to what was going to be my next question area, but now is a good time to ask it. It's a lot of this kind of, neoliberal, you would say, mumbo jumbo around social network, especially Facebook. And the internet in general, in the early years, we were talking about a global village and, a global community and, all sorts of other words that had other, perhaps more straightforward and down-to-earth meanings that became normative and idealized like that. I don't know, like connecting or browsing and, stuff like that. Why does sharing stand out for you?
Because it brings together three major areas of our social lives. I've mentioned the idea of sharing our emotions. So the word sharing ignites a set of associations of desired, intimate social relationships. Also, because it refers to a form of economic redistribution, if you like.
But economic in what sense? I mean, it is all online and virtual at the end of the day.
What I think we need to do is historically contextualize it. And so right now, for instance, we've maybe almost forgotten the crash of 2008. But that was a serious moment for many people around the world, especially in the United States. And out of that emerged what we now call the sharing economy. Now, to be sure, it was already there. There were companies that were already offering the kind of services that Zipcar and Airbnb offer. But I think there was something about this crash, this sense that the system isn't sustainable, that it is cruel and impersonal, that allowed the word sharing to reflect the desire among many people for a more human form of economic relationship and not only intimate, interpersonal relationships. Now, if we take that from around 2008, 2010, by this time, the idea of sharing had already taken root online. That was around 5 years earlier, not much before. So we've got that kind of digital sense of sharing. And then we've got a desire for some kind of economic change, along with also this consistent desire for community and authenticity in our relationships, which give the word sharing immense power now in our current moment.
Well, I think this is what's quite interesting about this distinction between the therapeutic sharing and the sharing as selling. They're not unrelated. I mean, they overlap with each other, right? Because in a way, the sharing of products, homes, cars, power drills is the example you give. It sort of undercuts normal capitalist culture, right? Because people are saying we can do this ourselves. We don't need to be, exploited by big businesses. And it generates new communities. People are couch surfing and Airbnb-ing and maybe meeting each other in different ways. So do they overlap? Is this an undercutting of traditional capitalist consumerism? Or in a way, you have this sentence where you say there's part of the sharing economy that turns us all into micro-entrepreneurs. Is it actually reinforcing the consumerist and capitalist culture? I know those are kind of two complicated questions.
I think it's both. There's a sense in which sharing is subversive, in that if I share my power drill, this is a very popular example among people in the sharing economy, because power drills just sit idle for 99% of their lifetimes. So why not share it with your neighbor?
Or in my case, 99.9%.
Probably that's closer to the truth. So there's a sense in which sharing can be subversive, because if we share our idle products, we will buy less. And this is one of the main arguments made by those who are in favor of collaborative consumption and certain parts of the sharing economy. This idea that we don't need to buy all this stuff, and we can save the world, and we can save money, and we can get to know our neighbors. So in that sense, there is something that could be subversive. However, what we now know is that when we think of the sharing economy, we think of Uber, which has been getting a terrible press in the last couple of years, and other Silicon Valley companies, Airbnb, for instance. So here we can see a reinforcement of trends towards, I don't know, the commodification of everything, if you like. And this is where I get to this idea of being a micro-entrepreneur comes from. But what is common to both this subversive moment of sharing and this moment of sharing where it seems to be reinforcing capitalist structures is that there is an expansion of the public at the expense of the private. We can see this in many ways. So the way that we talk about our emotions, we can see as an expansion of the public. We're making parts of ourselves public that previously we weren't. Now, whenever this happens, people are upset. When talk shows started in the States in the 1970s and the 1980s and reached peak popularity with Oprah, there were people who didn't understand why people would go on TV to tell everyone all this private stuff. Now we talk about oversharing as an expression of disdain towards over-publicizing what should be our private lives. And we can also think about Airbnb and couch surfing as both trends towards this greater publicness. In both instances, I have strangers in my house. In one instance, I'm charging them to be there. In the other instance, I'm not. That's a huge difference. Of course it is. However, in both instances, something that was private is being made public. And more of what we're making public is being monetized by third parties such as Airbnb, Facebook.
So is this where it overlaps with sharing on Facebook? Is sharing on Facebook the cultural logic of late capitalism, with apologies to Frederick Jameson?
It very well could be, because we are exposing ourselves. We are making more of our private lives public. We're doing so with the strong encouragement of multi-billion-dollar industries that are doing everything they can to squeeze more information out of us, because this is how they make money.
Our sharing is their earning, in
Absolutely.
other words. And not just our sharing of our data, but our sharing of our emotional lives.
Absolutely.
That's their income. They are commodifying sharing.
Absolutely. And they are making a lot of money off this idea that the way we should interact with other people is by being honest, open, authentic. The way that we create and sustain social ties is through these kinds of self-disclosure, which were called sharing back in the 1930s, and which companies such as Facebook now encourage for their own purposes, not necessarily for our sake.
You know, not to keep going backwards, but I do find this a fascinating evolution, the concept of sharing. One thing that I found missing from your book, and maybe it was purposeful on your part, is psychoanalysis. I mean, wasn't that really the start of everything, where we realized that opening up our troubles and problems was the way to a healthier human existence? I think, to my mind, that's the watershed. But the difference here is that we open it up not in the confidence of one person, but to some sort of bigger public. And not that I have to mention Philip Roth in every single session, but you raise him in your book as well. And you mention My Life as a Man, and of course, Portnoy before that. Isn't it real? Maybe we could say something in the 1960s and 70s. Roth really burst the banks of that kind of personal confidence by letting the reader see what's going on the couch. And that happened at a time when Alcoholics Anonymous was becoming big. I mean, what's the link between psychoanalysis and this confessional culture, and the leap between the personal confidence culture and the confessing to a whole group. And why in the 70s?
Of course, there are links. I mean, when I say therapeutic culture, part of what I mean is this turn among individuals to get advice and to feel better through talking with a therapist. That might be some kind of counselor or a psychoanalyst. But really, if I don't talk about psychoanalysis in the book, it's because I'm really following the word. And I guess it just didn't lead me there.
The word?
The word sharing. So it becomes a type of talk in the, like I mentioned, in the early 20th century. Around this time, psychoanalysis was emerging. This is clearly not a coincidence, and it harks back to what I mentioned earlier about this new type of self that's detached from the traditional anchors of society, such as the church or the family. And it speaks to people being kind of cast adrift in anonymous societies. This was a kind of common theme throughout social sciences in the early 20th century, still through to the present day, I guess. Now, what happened in the 1970s? The counterculture in the United States happened on the West Coast primarily, which is also where Silicon Valley resides, again, not coincidentally. And here there was once again a promise of some kind of redemption through openness and authenticity. This was also the time of consciousness raising, which was a group practice, but also absolutely the introduction of therapy into the everyday lives of more and more people.
I want to talk about today, this present moment. You mentioned earlier Uber and Facebook and all these money-making conglomerates that are, moving away from their original purpose of, sharing and community and kumbaya. And we also have started noticing like downsides to this culture, like shaming, for example, on social media, that, sharing has its limitations and people have started curtailing it. What do you see? Are we seeing a backlash, perhaps the very early chapters, the Roth?
That articles I used to teach my students, one article was called My Face Tube. That article is completely outdated by about 2 years later because MySpace isn't around anymore. And so nobody's going to hold you to every single thing you say, trust me.
No, but what I'm thinking about is this. My interest is primarily in the word and the concept of sharing. I feel I have less to say about the different practices that people do. Now, clearly there are negative aspects to our behaviors online. There are negative aspects to the company's behavior, the companies that we use to interact online.
No, but it affects directly how people perceive the concept of sharing, doesn't it?
So I have been wondering how long a shelf life my book will have, particularly now, a year and a couple of days since the election of Donald Trump. I think there are ways in which Donald Trump, if you compare him to Obama, is a kind of anti-sharing president. And again, I'm thinking about types of talk here. I'm thinking about the idea of a snowflake, the idea that we can't talk openly, that I'm not interested in actually what you have to say. I wonder if this may be a direction that we find ourselves going with sharing, that as a kind of type of therapeutic talk, it will be somehow kind of pushed back against. I don't think we're going to see less interaction on social media.
Okay, so you answered my question.
Well, but this is mind-boggling because actually, just thinking about what you're saying, there's so many different directions it could take. I mean, we're seeing the biggest outpouring ever of women talking about their sexual harassment experiences. Is that coincidental or not? I don't think it's coincidental either. I don't know what it necessarily says about your thesis, but I feel like the jury's not out. There's so many different directions this kind of sharing could go. And Donald Trump is certainly going to be a part of it, but in which direction? I'm not sure. Maybe he unleashes forces on all directions because he's so unrestrained that everybody else says, you know what? You're going to share your, totally unacceptable thoughts? Me too, so to speak.
This is not a prediction, far from it.
Yeah,
This is just a kind of very initial formulation of a thought that Donald Trump represents a different kind of communication, which isn't necessarily based on authenticity, honesty, openness, mutuality. However, it is equally the case that as he advances his agenda, there is resistance and there is pushback, and there may be recourse to the concept of sharing to resist this. That's totally possible, yeah.
And another thing I'm wondering, apropos Gilad's original question about the shelf life or the backlash on sharing, do you think there might be a collective understanding as this process evolves where people say, okay, I'm sharing with this huge anonymous public audience maybe I've got my privacy settings, a little bit limited, but I'm sharing with big audiences, all of my innermost habits and thoughts and feelings. And maybe the feedback I'm getting doesn't feel very real anymore. I mean, I think this is a critique that people feel is like you have these imagined communities, but not in the Anderson way of imagined communities, but in the sense that you have 1 million likes, you were supposed to feel great. And are we reaching the limits of that where people say those 1 million likes, they don't feel as good as a hug? I need a real community.
They may do, but the way they may phrase that would not be by discounting sharing. It would be by saying, this isn't the real, authentic kind of sharing that I'm striving for, at which point I would just want to remind such people that this real, authentic, true kind of sharing that they think they would like to be engaging in is not timeless. It is of a time. So even if they kind of don't like the way that Facebook is working for them, the standard that they're holding up is a new and modern standard.
Okay, I have to get to the question that is basically constantly on my mind every waking hour and probably most of my sleeping hours too. Ultimately, are we just sort of looking at a new platform, new technology platforms for kind of absorbing and giving expression to the processes of human nature and dynamics that have been processes throughout the last century and maybe are always part of who we are, right? Somehow sharing is always part of human existence. Are we really seeing a change in the human spirit and human interaction in who we are? Or is this just a phase of technology that will continue to reform itself over the years, but we will remain the same kind of human beings we always were?
Albeit on a much larger scale, of course.
I'm not sure that human beings have always been anything.
That's a big statement.
No, fair enough. What can I say?
But I like the way you started by saying, I'm not sure. That, to my mind, is the key sort of humility in your answer.
I think that once we start to talk about what we're doing in certain categories, then that feeds back into who we are. So this idea, for instance, that we have always been sharing. This is a popular trope particularly among people who are in favor of the sharing economy and think that it takes us back to some kind of original human state of pre-capitalist, almost everything, prehistorical almost. The way that you read people talking about tribes, for the listeners who can't see, I'm making air quotes with my fingers.
He is not.
Whether I am or am not.
It's just an alternate fact.
Yeah.
And people tend to say that, cavemen and these hunter-gatherer social groups were built around sharing. Now, I mean, there's an awful lot I could say about that, but one, I think I'll limit it to this. They didn't say that what they were doing was sharing, certainly not in the way that we mean when we say they were sharing. When we say the cavemen were sharing, we're implying that they had the same kind of ties with one another that we associate today with the concept of sharing.
That they had all read John Rawls and Distributive Justice.
So we take our present conception of sharing, we impose it on social groups in an entirely anachronistic way, and then we hold them up as the exemplars for how we are now today meant to behave. So there are some certain very fundamental aspects of human existence, like the desire for contact with other humans. Okay. I don't think that what we're seeing is just another iteration of some kind of grand human societal cycle, or that I don't really think that. I think that the word sharing encapsulates something about what it means to be human today. What it encapsulates something about our desire for intimacy, which is socially constructed, for the way that we wish to interact with other people that we know, strangers. And it also, I think, brings into focus the role of commercial entities in mediating all the different types of sharing that we do with one another.
I still think it's so interesting because it's almost like a backlash against the phase of individualization. I mean,
it is, but it is created by exactly the same forces.
I can't say it any better than that. Nobody can say it better than that because Nicholas John is the expert on what social media are doing to our lives and what it means to share. We've been discussing his book, The Age of Sharing, that was published in 2016 by Polity Press. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would like also to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Ramey Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. You too can help us survive. Just like Blanche Dubois, the Tel Aviv Review relies on the kindness of strangers. So if you like to be kind, don't be a stranger. Write to us, write to me, Gilad, G-I-L-A-D, at tlv1.fm, and we'll tell you how to. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive on www.tlv1.fm/podcasts. There are more than 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained and annoyed. Like us on Facebook, the Tel Aviv Review. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Dalia on Twitter, and please do share this item. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.